Let's picture 1960, rural Saskatchewan, and a baby is born without arms. Pretty hard place to keep things quiet. So the buzz got out, the word got out. My birth family were so shocked by the opinions of the medical community that I would never have any quality of life, that on day 5, I was homeless. So I was placed in a foster home with a couple in their mid-50s. Hilda Law was 55, Jack Law was 53. They had a small foster home and they had no intention of keeping any of these foster kids, but they saw these children as simply having a mistake. My mom had the best line ever. We don't care what happened to you, but we sure do care what's gonna happen next. And that was their mindset. So when they brought me home, it was gonna be temporary care. Mom said, we fell in love with you and we decided to keep you. There was something about my spirit. It wasn't damaged spirit. I was so loved. I was living in a home with older individuals, so practically growing up with grandparents. There's something about the magic of grandparents and their grandchildren that I was gifted by Jack and Hilda Law.
Welcome to the Calgary Sessions. This is episode number 151. I'm your host, Jeff Humphreys. Before I get into it today, I would love if you would subscribe or review the show or any other ones. I'm trying to get more exposure on the show. It's my sales pitch for the day. Today's guest. The world works in very interesting ways. He and I crossed paths online. He tracked me down based on having a friend on the show, and that's how this thing works. It's like this really cool community builder. And I get introduced to characters like this. So please name and who you are.
My name is Alvin Law, and I am a Hall of Fame Canadian professional speaker who has been doing this for way longer than anybody can believe. And I'm just delighted, live in Calgary, but I'm so pumped to be with you in Calgary because you're doing some amazing stuff, Bud. I'm just real proud to be part of this.
Which is really cool, right? I think it's, when I come across individuals or individuals come across me, it's cool to make those connection points, right? Because without this environment and this show, you and I don't get to meet and hang out and talk. So it's very unique.
There was, not to bring this thing up, but there was a lot of COVID stuff.
Yeah.
My son, for example, loved COVID because he's a bit of a hermit. He's 39 years old. But I think COVID really affected people's social strategies. And I don't think that was a good thing. We're sitting in a building that's normally a restaurant. The idea that you can order on Skip the Dishes or whoever, fine. I'm not anti-enterprise, but I am definitely pro show up and be there for the people of this restaurant, the chef, the staff, the people that wait on you, to experience the restaurant, not be lazy and sit at home and go, feed me, feed me, feed me. That's just not my thing. But then I'm 64 years old, so I guess I'm guilty of that.
Which is also, like you and I just talked about too, like the idea of getting like face-to-face podcasts. That's why I love this format, this setup, because it's an exchange in energy right now versus sitting behind screens, which is also great. Like it's an option, but when this is also an option, this is the better option.
Way option. And the thing I love too is I'm very much a people person, which is a bit counterintuitive because the way that my body is shaped, I've had a lot of grief from people that don't appreciate the look of my body. Yeah. But I find I can change their mind in about 30 seconds by simply looking them in the eye and making sure their eyes aren't focusing on what's missing, just to see the person in front of them, not to get all warm and fuzzy about that. No. But that's what I've been doing my whole life. Yeah. And, engaging with people. Getting relationships is one thing, but being genuine, living in the moment, all those cliches, we're going to talk about those today because they are a profound part of what made me who I am from the time that I was born, not just in the last few years where this kind of new age stuff has been the discussion points. Yep. When I talk about my wife as we go along here, she's like the guru of new age spirituality. So, she's taught me a lot about presence and all those code words, mindfulness, consciousness, yada, yada, yada. But they mean something to me. They're not just words that are thrown out willy-nilly because they make you look like you're a cool dude. Yeah. I've been a cool dude ever since I discovered jazz, but we'll talk about that as we go along.
Have you seen one of these shows?
I have. I've seen actually 3 or 4 of them I watched because the one that I watched with my pal Lisa was what caught my attention because she sent a note out about it because social media, and I'm definitely going to do that. So then I got curious and I thought, I'm just going to send this guy a note. I'm just going to do it. I don't do that. I'm not a cold caller, you know?
Yeah.
But I was so impressed with the vibe. That's what I love the most. And I really believe it's because we're sitting across from each other rather than staring into my iPad in my office in Calgary, which is fine.
Yep.
That was a Zoom COVID thing.
Yep. But
I still think we need to be face to face.
Yeah. And this is like in this environment specifically, it's like, you got to make the effort to get here.
Yeah.
And then once you get here, it's kind of, for whatever reason, there's this tone in this room that actually like it creates an energy or a connection like fairly quickly.
Yeah.
I don't know what it is, but it's like it's a unique situation.
You did not stumble into this opportunity by accident. Let's just put it that way. This was always going to happen to you as long as you opened the portal and let it take place. Because this is what led you into this enterprise.
Yep.
But at the end of the day, you understand another thing, which I've always understood. It's kind of about us, but it's about who's watching.
For sure.
The learning curve.
I agree. I'm glad you've seen a couple of these because what I'm about to ask you, you have some context or where this is going to go or potentially go. So walk this thing back. Where you grew up, how you grew up, parents, siblings, jobs, school, experiences to where you are today. And we'll just, I'll poke you with a couple questions here and there and we'll just kind of weave our way to where you are today. So walk it back.
I have a line that I use from my mother that started in 1963. People would come up and ask her, what happened to your little boy? And my mom would say, ask him. He's got a voice. He's not an idiot. I've been telling this story for all of my life, ever since I have a memory. So it's a great story. And I know that's what you love.
Yeah.
It's telling stories.
Totally.
I love telling stories too. They started being about me, but as I expanded in my own experiences with life, I started to realize, and this is that cliche again, brother, everybody has a story. What you do with that story represents where you go with that life you've been given. So when people see me for the first time, they assume it's a terrible story because the first thing people notice, unless I'm wearing a big coat, is I have no arms. And that gets attention. So then the next question obviously becomes, why? Well, I was born this way. So then we connect a few more dots, and depending on the generation, people will know this word or they won't know this word, and the word is thalidomide. Do you know the word thalidomide?
I've heard of it, yeah.
Thalidomide was pretty much, this is the definition of the word, an infamous pharmaceutical product. And I would normally not do this. I definitely have done it a few times on stage, but I stopped because it made people uncomfortable. But I think we're going to do it today because I think you would appreciate the very dark history of that drug that most human beings don't know. When you mention thalidomide, I can't even count the number of people, especially older women, that go, oh, I was going to be given that drug when I was pregnant to help me with morning sickness. And then they say this, Jeff, thank God I didn't because I had a normal baby. I've heard that more times than I can count. Does that offend me? Not even a little bit, because that's the perception, that it would be terrible to have a baby like this. And you know what? It was. There's no doubt about it. There was nothing you could say that was good about this medication. It affected people from around 1958 to around 1963. It started in Germany. A pharmaceutical company called Grunenthal, who still exists to this day, believe it or not, came up with a non-barbiturate sedative that they could give to pregnant women before we had to test any pharmaceuticals to go to market. But to make this even more, this is really tricky, and I hate these things called trigger alerts, but I want to warn your audience what I'm going to talk about next because it's not a friendly thing. In the research that I've done, both in my personal life, but also as a member of the originating body of the Thalidomide Victims Association of Canada in 1988, I got involved in a research group that looked into the history of this drug. And when I found this out, I literally dropped on the floor and cried. Thalidomide was invented at Auschwitz. It was designed to be a sedative to control the people that we all know the stories about. Not personally, of course, I'm sure. But that was the kind of the history. There was a very, very huge lack of moral consciousness during that time. You would think the history of that place and other death camps would have been enough to stop the sale of this drug. But the creepy part is this batch of people that were all scientists with the SS escaped war crimes, started the company called Grunenthal, and started inventing other pharmaceuticals, including thalidomide, which made millions of dollars in the late 50s and early 60s because it worked. It worked. And in fact, the irony is last year, Grunenthal made, I didn't check the statistics for 2024, but 2023, somewhere around $6 billion on the sale of thalidomide. Wow. Here's the catch. Talk about a weird thing in my personal life. I actually spoke to a national conference for multiple myeloma patients. That is the blood cancer. Thalidomide is the only known treatment for multiple myeloma, and it works. Thalidomide was also very effective in treating the early stages of AIDS. So the drug itself was not the issue. This is what I find interesting, because everyone says, oh, you must just hate that company and hate thalidomide. I don't hate anything. I don't like the Calgary Stampeders, but I'm a Saskatchewan Roughrider fan. But we won't go there. Anyway, the reality is thalidomide was the best thing that ever happened to me. And when I say that, it shocks people. I'm not talking about what happened to the rest of the world. I'm talking about how that drug, which was basically taken, I suppose, in the first trimester of me being a fetus, my arms didn't grow. So when I was born in the summer of 1960, that was me. Hello world, Yorkton, Saskatchewan, I'm here. The trouble was there was a stigma that nobody knew about yet because thalidomide was being kept in the dark. It was a scandal. The fact of the matter is, let's just pause for a sec. Let's picture 1960, rural Saskatchewan, and a baby is born without arms. Pretty hard place to keep things quiet. So the buzz got out, the word got out, but the negativity of the words were even more powerful. My birth family were so shocked by the opinions of the medical community that I would never have any quality of life. I know this sounds predictable, but it's so real that on day 5, I was homeless. I had nowhere to go. My birth family essentially signed papers giving me away. They were assured that I would be taken care of by the government of Saskatchewan. That was code for institutionalization. But I had to live somewhere for a while before I was capable of handling any kind of environment. So I was placed in a foster home with a couple in their mid-50s. Hilda Law was 55, Jack Law was 53. They had a small foster home where they didn't take care of young babies or toddlers or young children. They had no intention of keeping any of these foster kids because they were then the version of empty nesters. They'd already raised their family. My brothers John and Terry, born in 1932 and 1936. So now I'm dating things a little bit here. So they would take care of problem children. They would take care of teenagers involved with police issues or justice issues. And I'm going to be really honest about this. A significant number of them were First Nations people. But this is what's fascinating to me. They were not judging these kids. You know, there wasn't this sort of diatribe like we have now about race. These kids had issues. A lot of them had fetal alcohol syndrome, and they would come into our home, and I just love this part of the story. Jack and Hilda Law had a faith. They were religious, but they saw these children as simply having a mistake. My mom had the best line ever. We don't care what happened to you, but we sure do care what's going to happen next. And that was their mindset. So when they brought me home, it was going to be temporary care.
You were young, right?
I was a week old.
Yeah.
Then they decided they were going to try to keep me till I was a little more independent. Now, your audience can grab their tissues because this is just a great line. Mom said, we fell in love with you, and we decided to keep you. And my dad said, yeah, I hear that. He kind of grows on you. You just got to give it a little time. There was something about my spirit. It wasn't damaged spirit. It was this other kind of spirit. Everybody that saw me, first reaction, horrible, negative. But then they would listen to me laugh or watch me spontaneously as I got older talk. I was precocious. But that's because, here's another good one, I was so loved. I was living in a home with older individuals, so practically growing up with grandparents. You know, I don't know if you can relate to this, buddy, but grandparents, hey, grandparents, if you're listening to this, you love the line, right? I wish I would have had my grandchildren first. Exactly. There's something about the magic of grandparents and their grandchildren that I was gifted by Jack and Hilda Law.
It's the start of a wild story, right? Like,
well, that's why, you know, and that's why I tell it.
Like
Not because I'm full of myself. It's a good story, huh?
Well, and it's just, people have questions, right?
Oh, they do.
People always want to questions about anything, right? They want to know how this thing works. Like, how does this whole podcast thing work?
Sure.
Like, there's always the behind. That's why this format is so cool, because you actually get to hear the story. So
yeah, I also think talk about origin stories. I'm gonna hoist the flag for a second. Believe that, I don't know what percentage. There's no percentage, but the impact small town Saskatchewan had on my upbringing is impossible to state, because that's exactly what it was. Let's just pull in the stereotype. It was a rural community, and mom and dad were established in that rural community, so they were going everywhere. So in my early days, now I was again a victim of thalidomide, but I was also a wonderful part of this thing that was going on in our society, where we were starting to see more and more people with disability, and some of them were starting to do some pretty amazing things. So the old model of broken individuals, which, by the way, Jeff, I don't know if this is going to resonate or not, but the biggest model of disability was caused by all of the wounds of World War II. It was the first time we saw en masse people that were damaged by conflict, and it bothered people. We started to see artificial limbs. They weren't the kind we have today. They were the ones with the old hooks or artificial legs, or people that lost limbs in wheelchairs. And because it was caused by conflict, it had a real negative buzz to it. But I think the bigger buzz was that these were people that had lives that were all of a sudden changed dramatically. I was born this way. There was nothing wrong with me. And that was the big key. So mom and dad weren't embarrassed to take me to the bowling alley or take me to the curling rink. Or I would go to with my mom to the church. She was one of those women that volunteered for funerals to cook for the luncheon afterwards. So I'd be walking around 3-4 years old going, don't cry, everything's going to be okay. And I didn't know. I must have been to 100 funerals before I was 6 years old. That changes you.
For sure.
You start to understand the life and death cycle. But oddly, it also made me very conscious of the fact my parents were not young. That was a big thing. That was a bit of a problem on occasion, because all of my friends that I had parents were in their 20s. Mom and dad were in their 50s. So when I cruised along through my elementary education and got into high school, etc., the whole thing was predicated on these aging parents.
Yeah.
But for some reason, and I think I know the answer to this, they stayed young. You know, everyone talks about what Hilda and Jack Law did for Alvin Law, until I ran into a lady 1,000,000 years ago who said, yeah, but no one ever talks about what you did to Hilda and Jack Law. You gave them this life, this energy. And it was because I was popular. You know, everyone says, were you bullied? No. Really? One kid bullied me. In fact, this is a great story.
Right, so give some context. So what, like elementary?
It started about 10, 11. That's when kids, if you think about it, even in 2024, 25, kids gravitate to each other around 10 or 11 years old. When they're little kids, unless they're involved in activities, that's a different thing. You know, sports, for example, if you're, I'm sure you've heard the stories. We've all heard the hockey mom stories and the baseball mom stories and the football mom stories. Well, I didn't have that kind of community. I had a very big community of all of these people that I would interact with all the time. So I knew these kids. But when kids start to gravitate towards other activities, they also gravitate towards negativity. So a lot of these kids that were making fun of me, the one or two that were the real problem, I would find out later would have a huge problem of their own. But the funniest story ever, I mean, this is a good one. We have a cottage in Saskatchewan, which I don't need to talk about unless you ask me about it again. But I'm so lucky we get to go and spend our summers in Saskatchewan, because that's where I grew up. Mom and dad started going to this lake called Crystal Lake in 1948, believe it or not. Anyway, we started going out to our own cottage, my wife and I, in 2006. We bought one and we travel there every summer. And we have a lot of friends. I mean, I've got a lot of friends and people that I grew up with. As it turned out, we also were hosting a little informal get-together of the cabinet ministers and the deputy premier of Saskatchewan at our cottage one summer. And the deputy premier was the only one that wasn't on our deck drinking beers. And I knew for a fact he didn't drink, his religion. But he was down on our dock, and I thought just for a moment he was checking out the view, but he just kind of sat down there. And I wondered if he was uncomfortable about the drinking. So I went down to say, are you okay, buddy? And he's, yeah, I'm fine. But he says, I'm not sure if I'm welcome here. I said, is it the alcohol? He goes, no, it's something else. You don't remember, do you? And I'm looking at him, and I swear to God I didn't remember. And he goes, don't you remember what happened between us back in 1970? I went, all right. He was one of my bullies.
No way.
He was a white guy. And I'm saying that because he wasn't some person who was upset about their race.
Yep.
His family were very successful. They had a garbage company that we would now look at as waste management, but his dad was just a bad guy, an alcoholic, one of those wicked people. So this man, I'll leave his name out, became that product. Therefore, he was just taking out all of that anxiety on, and he wasn't just picking on me, he was picking on anybody that was what we would today call marginalized.
Yeah.
But here's the thing, man, and I'm not advocating this, all right? Just a warning to all the parents watching. The cottage was a place where I learned to throw rocks and skip stones with my foot, and I was really good at it. So I kept warning him, if you keep making fun of me, I'm going to throw a rock at you. My parents would have never advocated violence. So one day he went over the edge, I threw a rock at him, hit him right in the forehead. It was a great shot. It was like 50 feet across the playground. You could even watch it curve as it hit him in the forehead. Gave him a cut. He started to cry, of course, but I got detention for throwing the rock. Anyway, he's recounting this story. So I said, that was 1970. I've moved on, man. Mm-hmm. Could you move on? Mm-hmm. He goes, I just don't know how to say I'm sorry. Well, give me a hug. How about that? See, I've never been one to hold a grudge because it's not healthy, in my opinion. So that's why when I say I had a glorious childhood in rural Saskatchewan, I literally mean it. It could be a movie of the week about growing up in this beautiful place. But that's not to take away the genuine challenges of being born without arms. I think that's the part that I kind of let be on the back burner because I don't want to make a big deal about it. They don't bring back bad memories. But if people are trying to imagine, how do you overcome having no arms? I'll be very honest, it was not easy.
Obviously now you're got years under your belt. You have a bunch of experiences. You've thought about this. You talk about this. Like it's all, it makes a lot of sense. Back then though, when you were like living it, when you were a youngster, the idea of looking at it from this positive perspective, but also the realities you were living in and the positive and the negatives, like were you able to deal with it, or did your parents kind of help you like work through it, good day, bad day? Like what did that actually look like back then?
The answer is both. There were clearly bad days. And this is not going to surprise anybody. The worst time in my life was about 2 years in adolescence when puberty hit. And all of a sudden I hit early puberty. So I had hair on my chest. I had hair on my legs. I had big hair on my head. I had hair like you, but it wasn't curly. But, that was the 70s.
Yep.
What I also had was more concern about the life of my parents because I was worried at that age, especially as an adolescent, what if my mom and dad die? Right? Because they were aging.
Yeah.
Didn't know that was going to happen. But I also think that as time went by, the future started to enter into my brain. You didn't have the future like you have today where you can look at the internet and figure out what you want to do. Yeah. I had to figure out certain things. But I think what really was critical was this whole environment of the 60s and 70s was not like today's, whatever you want to call it. We have the acronym of DEIB for diversity, equity, inclusion, and now belonging, which I will give credence to, although I got my feelings about that, to be quite blunt. But we didn't have that. Yeah. So here's a perfect example of an answer to your question. Old story, significant story. 1966, there's nothing I can't do with my feet. My mom and dad have taught me, mostly my mom, to do things like, I'll just give you an example without screwing up your camera thing here a little bit, but I learned how to hold a cup like this. And it's interesting you have a handle on this, that you didn't give me something without a handle. That's common. Most people would not think of that. If I've got a handle, I can grab it. Yeah. But because of the proximity of the cameras, I'm not reaching up to have a drink. But that's how I learned Mom was not taking care of me like people might think.
Yeah.
Mom was making me do things to make me independent. And let's not get all romantic here. She told me several times this was because they were concerned, would I be independent enough to live on my own once I got to be 18 or 19 years old? That was the objective. There was no plan. The only plan was, and this is going to be just so funny to your audience, and some of you are going to just nod your heads, they wanted to get rid of me.
Yep.
They were looking forward to me going out into the world and finding my way because they were both immigrants. That was in their psychology. Mm-hmm. They both immigrated to Canada. And that mindset of go see the world was very much a part of that. It never occurred to them the world wouldn't be ready for a dude with no arms, right? But that was not my concern. My concern at that time was very much predicated on the answer to this story. So 1966, there's a school right across the street from our house in Yorkton, Saskatchewan called St. Alphonsus Elementary School. It's a public Catholic school, grade 1 to grade 6, no kindergarten. And it was right across the street. Mom and Dad weren't naive. They knew there was going to be some different conversations, but they literally believed, we'll just take them across the street. So they literally took me across the street. I'll always remember, I can remember this day like it was yesterday. Stuff in the library. I had a donut. I don't know why I remember that. By the way, a donut fits perfect on your big toe. Check it out sometime. Mom and Dad had a coffee and a tea or whatever. We had dainties, you toured around the school. The teachers had decorated all the walls. Go into the principal's office. He seemed like a good guy. Close the door and he simply looks at Mom and Dad and says, he can't come here. And my dad goes, we live across the street. By the way, my dad had a very British accent, which I'm not going to mimic, but it was a very, very important part of understanding his international mindset, okay? And the principal said, well, he can't come here because that's the way things are. And Mom went, well, he needs to go to school. Where's he supposed to go? Oh, Mrs. Law, there's a school across town for kids like him. And Mom went, kids like who? And the principal said, using an ugly word we should get rid of, well, Mrs. Law, crippled kids like him. Points at me. You can't make this stuff up. My mom goes, he's not crippled. Principal looks at my mom like there was something wrong with her too. Mrs. Law, Mr. Law, he's got no arms. What do you call that? Mom went, Alvin. Great story, huh? Not done yet. He didn't laugh. You know what he said? Be that as it may, there's nothing I can do. So, I don't want to get deep into history here, but this fascinates me. I've thought about this my whole life. Didn't think about it that day in 1966. My dad was an immigrant. He came from England when he was 16 years old by himself on a boat. Worked his way across Canada to where he eventually ended up in rural Saskatchewan, a little town called Kenora, one of the major rail terminals in Western Canada, believe it or not, in 1920s. He would meet my mom, a farm girl. They would become a couple, then get married, blah, blah, blah. But the point is they had moved to Yorkton when Dad got the best job of his life ever. He became the service manager for the biggest farm implement dealership in the entire region, International Harvester Trucks and Tractors. He had a dozen or 15 employees under him, mechanics. He was responsible for fixing trucks and tractors in rural Saskatchewan, tractors and combines in particular. What do you not say to a trucker or a farmer? There's nothing I can do. So I watched my dad, and his ears perked. But what I saw was my mom cry. It wasn't sad tears. It wasn't sympathy tears. It was almost like tension tears. And you should have been in that room. My dad saw my mom cry. Mm-hmm. And then he looked at the man that made my mom cry. And by the way, my dad was also an ex-professional heavyweight boxer.
All right, so had a presence to him.
He says, Hilda, I think you need a break, dear. Why don't you take the boy here, go back to the library, get another donut, get another tea. The principal and I were going to have a chat now. Real story. 20 minutes later, Dad comes out, big smile. Hey, kid, you're going to school here tomorrow. Honestly, Jeff, I thought my dad beat up the principal. But there wasn't a mark. What he did was educate the principal. Mm. And this is way ahead of the curve, okay, as the way we think of today. Mm-hmm. He said, let's just give it a try. Mm. We live across the street. By the way, all of his friends come here. Doesn't that count for something? Mm-hmm. He says, we've never done this before. And Dad says, well, what a coincidence. Neither have we. How about we work towards a solution? That was maybe not the words my dad used, but that was the sentiment of the moment. Yeah. The point is, this may not sit well with some of your listeners. I learned from 6 years old, education is not a right. It's a privilege. Mm. To be able to go to school is a privilege. And too many kids, are you listening? You take your education for granted. It may not be the best system in the world, but the reality is we need an education in our world to not only expand our brains to learn things, but to kind of give us some perspective, through the education we get. But the key, and this is where the COVID thing kind of creeps into this again, we needed to be together. Mm. I needed to go to school with other kids. I learned how to handle them, but more than anything, they had to learn how to handle me. Mm-hmm. I still run into kids that say the best education they ever got on diversity and inclusion was going to school with Alvin Law.
It's like you're actually doing the work, right?
Yeah.
You're actually doing the thing, learning, evolving, helping, all the things. It's not a theory. It's actually doing it.
And there was no sympathy.
Yeah.
So I almost failed grade 11 math, right? But one could say, well, why would they do that? Because that's what the right thing to do was.
Yeah.
If I'm not getting the grades, if I want to go out into that world at 18 years old, my mom and dad were trying to push me into, what was I going to do? We'll talk about that later. But the reality was that didn't mean that I woke up every morning at 6 a.m. and bounced out of bed going, I get to go to school, I get to go to school, I get to go to school. I was a typical kid in that school was sometime a drag.
Yep.
But then things changed that would make my education not only relevant, but make me understand probably the most powerful story that I own is what happened next.
When you're a youngster, junior high or elementary, junior high, do you have like what's got your attention? What is it? Like what's got your, you said like you get out of bed, not every day you wanted like you're jacked to go to school, but what had your attention back then? Like what were you focused on, thinking about?
If your audience is old enough to be children of the 60s and 70s, that's what it was. It was a time of love and peace and harmony and great Coca-Cola commercials on TV and a feeling like we're all in this together. We should embrace this. But the big thing for me that made me get out of bed every day and go to school was music. Music is what changed everything. And it wasn't in one story. It was a bunch of different things that happened in coordination with my parents. Let's be honest. Mom and dad were trying to figure out what I should do. Okay. So,
do you think they felt pressure around that idea? Do you think it was like, as they're prepping you to be, 18 and kind of live your life and be independent, do you think there was, or maybe they said it to you, like, do you think there was pressure for them to figure it out?
There was a back pressure. And I'll tell you exactly what that expression means. Part of what was confusing, very much to me, but I think very much to them, and we'd never actually had this conversation that I can remember, doesn't mean we didn't have it, from the age of 3, because I was a foster child who was given legal custody to my parents, they couldn't adopt me because of the rules of Saskatchewan at the time, I had to go to hospitals. I was a guinea pig for artificial arms. So I was at probably 70, 80 clinics by the time I was 6 years old with doctors being fascinated by this thing. And that's really kind of what it was. That was the trouble. I was a thing. I was an experiment. I played along. Mom and dad were always, especially my dad, because my dad was a veteran of World War II, they painted as a small child saying, well, this is going to be your fight. Do the right thing and you'll get a medal for your own courage, blah, blah, blah. It worked. It was mysticism at the time. What are you talking about? But I understood it. I had a job to do. But what I think gave this thought to my parents, especially my mom, was seeing what hospital patients really looked like. If I may say this without being offensive, real victims, people that had real issues, people that had given up on their lives. Mom and dad would see these people in the hospitals that I would hang around with. And I can vividly remember that being a frame for me as I got older. This is going to sound crude, but the last thing I wanted to do was hang around with handicapped people. I just didn't want to hang out with them. I didn't like that. I didn't like the model of it. So therefore, I think the pressure for my parents was to not let me slide into the victim mentality.
Yep.
But I needed also to find something that was going to make me feel like I was doing something.
Yep.
And, I often joke about this. And again, I know a few of your guests have a hockey background. That was a real story. Dad thought, okay, well, we'll try to teach you how to skate. It failed miserably because the first time I tried to skate, I fell on my face. Okay. But instead of my dad racing out onto the ice and picking me up and taking me to Dairy Queen, my dad's on the boards kind of leaning. He was from England. He didn't skate. He's yelling at me going, what are you doing? And I said, bleeding? And he swear to God, he said, well, stop that. You're making a mess. I'm going to have to clean that up. There wasn't a lot of sensitivity in my dad like we have today, okay? Yeah. But he was an old school British guy. He had a reality to him, though. My dad was a man of great honor. So they tried stuff. Obviously, soccer, or the proper title, football, was a sport that seemed intriguing because my dad was from England. And of course, my oldest joke that I own, I got a lot of jokes, buddy, but my oldest joke that I own is I never got the penalty for touching the ball with my hands, right? Yay. But music was what I loved.
Did they like music also?
Oh, they were lovers of music.
And like music around the house?
Music playing on the radio all the time. My dad and mom had a big console stereo, a Fleetwood it was called, and a collection of blues and jazz and big band albums.
Like the console when it's like the record player's sunk down and there's things on the side, the speakers.
2 huge speakers and a black and white TV. And it was like a piece of, it was like a shed that sat in our basement, right?
Yeah.
I loved that music. But real impact of music was church. Going to school, going to church and singing on Sundays. I had a lucky turn that I had a great voice. And it was just the way it was. But it wasn't just the voice. It was the lack of fear of singing out loud. I didn't get embarrassed by it. In fact, if anything, to be quite honest, one of the first things I remember, and I just say, why did I say be quite honest? That's a silly expression. We have a family folklore story of me starting to sing at weddings in Yorkton during the break when the band wouldn't play polka music. And apparently I would get up and sing You Are My Sunshine at 3 and 4 years old. And of course the crowd is just, oh, look at that sweet little boy. Well, you know what? Positive attention is a remarkable thing. It builds your confidence. It gives you that energy you were talking about, right? But I think the key to all of this, I wasn't overcoming anything. This was the way my body was. This was what I used for my hands. This is the way things were. But I needed to find something that made sense. So my mom took me to a lady to teach me piano one day. And the lady was just, she was straightforward and blunt, and maybe what might, to some of your listeners, be offensive. She basically shut me down. Yeah. She said, you'll never play piano. Your toes are just too short. I love the fact you try with your feet, Alvin, but pianos are for fingers. That's what they're made for. And, I guess that's true. Probably makes sense. But the reality was there was another opportunity that at the time seemed like the last one. Because I wasn't playing sports. I wasn't involved in art. I wasn't very good at drawing, so I wasn't, coloring and making wonderful pieces of work. I wanted to try something. So they put me into tap dancing. And I started to tap dance. I think my dad secretly wanted me to be Sammy Davis Jr. That was one of my dad's favorite. Never occurred to my dad that Sammy Davis Jr. was black. Honest to God, it never occurred to him. It was like, look at that guy dance. Look at him sing. You could do that. I did tap dance for 10 years, actually, and I was pretty good at it. But what was funny about it was all of these elements of entertaining that I loved the most. I love to show off. I can't lie.
And like always, like were you
always
a youngster, like
look at me,
and just
instead of look at me, the negative one. Look at me, look what I can do. Yeah. And because it was amazing, people would go, wow, or they'd clap. Well, they loved me. I even got on local television. If anybody has any history of Yorkton, Saskatchewan, CKOS television, the only station we got, right? CBC back in the 60s, one channel. But what was funny about it was that nobody knew what that was going to look like. Everybody thought it's cute. But was I really going to be a professional tap dancer? Probably not. The world was not ready for that. Yeah. So
it's interesting that as you're telling the story, obviously, and you're going through the sports, what works, what doesn't. And I'm here thinking like, I wonder, like, it takes some creativity, especially in that era.
Oh, yeah.
To find something that you might be interested in, half good at, like, because you got to be creative. You got to be a creative thinker and actually expose you to different things where you can excel. So when you said tap, I was like, I would have never got to tap dancing.
Imagine that Mom couldn't Google no arms. Right? Siri, what do we do? Siri, YouTube
nothing.
Video for this? No, nothing.
No, there's nothing in like the local paper that says like...
The other thing that was fascinating, I actually have still got this article from Life magazine. There was a major spread done on the drug thalidomide. And my mom had found it. She didn't let me read it when I was little, but eventually I would get the magazine. Yeah. The other problem of the time was thalidomide news had surfaced. And now there was all these negative stories that were floating around about all these poor kids born missing their limbs. Yeah. Ironic, isn't it? We didn't have media. The Yorkton CBC was not covering thalidomide. And besides, at the end of the day, Mom didn't know. Yeah. Because even my own birth family didn't know. There was no causation that they understood at the time. Yeah. But what's fascinating is, as time went by, what my parents probably recognized was the artificial arms weren't working. They did nothing for me. I finally, at 15 years old, basically stood up for myself as a teenager and told the medical community, I don't need these things anymore. And they got rid of them. They finally woke up to the reality that I didn't need arms. But what I needed was some place for me to not only fit, but to thrive.
Yeah. Creativity, right? To find those places. But I guess you had the attitude that you were willing to try them too, right?
So, yes, except here is where the power of my life story is assigned to somebody else. See, I think the one thing that people forget about is you can do achievements on your own, but you can't do it alone. Nobody does. You can be a superstar hockey player on the rink outside your back of your yard in your school or wherever, but unless you play that game to get into hockey, as an example, especially a Canadian one, it's way harder than people think to become an NHL player, right? Isn't it? You've talked to them. It's a common story. I don't think we really appreciate the sacrifice that people give up for their kids to be professional anything. So you need somebody to come along. And I would think, and I believe this is my best story. 1971, exactly a year after the lady that said I'd never play piano, Mom gets a phone call. Now this is a stage speech. I told this story so many times.
I'm not confused.
But it is a powerful thing.
There's a reason you go there, right?
There's an absolute reason.
There's something like deep behind this. It's not just for shits and giggles.
And it sounds like an Alvin story, but it turns. So I'm at school. My mom gets a phone call on the old telephones we used to have back in the 70s. Call goes exactly like this. Mrs. Law, introduce myself. My name is Blaine McClary. I'm a brand new music director for the Yorkton School music programs. I have instituted a policy where all fifth graders have to take a music aptitude test. And I'm calling you at home, I hope you don't mind, to tell you that your son got 96%, which means he needs to be in the school band. Now, I'll ask your audience to picture this without even looking at me, okay? Picture that conversation without any video. So Mom goes, really? Wow, this sounds interesting. Now imagine the 10 years of backstories in my mom's head about all the stuff they've tried, and now a guy's phoning, I want him in the band, where my mom is kind of thinking, I know where this is going to go. She says, that's great. That's a good mark. It is, Mrs. Law, one of the best in town. So would your son be interested in being in the band? And she said, oh, I'm sure he would, but did you have an instrument in mind? He says, you know what? Don't let this get out. It's kind of against policy. But with this kind of talent, I'd love him to just pick any instrument he wants. Would that be okay with you? Mom says, and you can't make this stuff up, right? Okay, have you met him? No, it's got his name on a test score here. Why, is that important? Mom's like, well, good time to tell you, Alvin, she actually said this, Alvin sort of has no arms. And then it's quiet. And I'll let your audience guess what he answered. He says, you're kidding. Mom goes, no, it's not kidding, honest. He was born that way. But he's pretty independent. And the band director's going, okay, you know what? I wish somebody would have told me this. I have no idea what to tell you now, Mrs. Law, except I feel really uncomfortable. I'm glad I didn't set this thing up with your kid to disappoint him. But, let's be blunt. You probably hear this. There's no way your kid is ever going to be in the band. And that was the end of the call. It was polite, but it's not over. That's what I love about stories. You think you're done, and then you find there's another part to the story. 6 weeks later, I walk in after school one day. Mom has this big smile. Mom had a great smile. She had ugly teeth, but she had a great smile. It's another thing about my mom I loved. She was not vain. And she just basically says, you're going to be in the band. And I, what? We have to get in the car. I've made an appointment. We're going to go to the high school and meet somebody, and I'll tell you the story on the way. Well, on the way, she tells me about the 6 weeks ago. And I swear to God, Jeff, I said, why do you keep telling people I have no arms? That's what I said in my 11 almost year old brain. It was May, and I turned 11 in July, right? And essentially, we go to the school. And this Yorkton High School was pretty new. It was a beautiful building. It had all kinds of wings for a small town school, including a theatrical department with a full-size theater, a music wing with full-size band stuff, and a vocational wing where they taught trades. We go to the vocational wing, we go into this room, this funny-looking chair sitting on the floor, and funny-looking chair because it was a wooden teacher's chair. but the right arm had been sawed off. And the left arm had a metal rod bolted on the side of it with a clamp welded on the top. And there was another rod on the back of the chair with a clamp welded on the top. And on the floor was a long black leather case. Mr. McClary sits me in the chair, opens up the case, takes out, puts together, and inserts in these clamps a trombone. A trombone, for goodness sake. And like a game show host, he goes, "What do you think?" Well, what was I supposed to think? It was the stupidest looking thing I'd ever seen in my entire life. Can you move the slide with your foot? So of course I reach up with my foot. Yeah, I can move the slide with my foot. Can you make this noise? Okay. Can you do it in the mouthpiece and move the slide? Well, this noise comes out. And, it was a wonderful noise. I played a little, locked the slide. I vividly remember sitting there not having a clue what to feel. But Mr. McClary, with almost tears in his eyes, says, "This is what you're going to play in the band, boy." He was from the States, had a accent, it was Oklahoma, Texas accent.
Yep.
There were 2 other teachers in the room. The physics instructor at the high school, his name was Mr. Yasinski, and the woodworking teacher, whose name was Mr. Wood. Mr. Wood...
You're not even making this up.
I'm not making this up. Mr. Wood happened to go to our church where I sang in the choir. Mr. Wood knew Mom and Dad. Mr. Wood and Mr. Yasinski and Mr. McClary are all smoking a cigarette in the teacher's lounge one day when they could do that. And Mr. McClary, Blaine brings up this story about this kid. Mr. Wood goes, "I know that kid. He's amazing. You should see him use his feet. He can reach anything." The wheels begin to spin and they create a project. Why would they do this though, Jeff? That's the question I've never quite fully understood. I've asked them. They gave me very polite answers. But why would they care about one kid? Because that was rural Saskatchewan. That's my answer. It's the only one I can come up with. Because it doesn't make any sense. Who goes, no arms, trombone? Actually, all I could think about that day was, how am I going to march? But
it's funny you say trombone. When I was in junior high, that was one of my instruments.
Really? Did you like it?
No, man.
I know, exactly. Most people don't.
But as you say it, though, I'm like, with the movement, and I'm watching you like the dexterity with your lower limbs, like it's all, I'm like, this actually makes sense.
But here's the part, and again, I know everyone's got a story. Would never suggest mine's better than anyone's, because there's no game, right? There's no competition. There's no trophy. But imagine now how this plays out. Remember the big band music and the stereo in the basement? Well, my trombone was in the basement, and I would play and practice and learn from the basics, from beginner books. But then my dad starts thinking, okay, you're not going to be Sammy Davis Jr. Maybe you could be Tommy Dorsey or Glenn Miller, trombone players, right? And he would put on these bands, and I would listen to these trombone players. And as I got older and more capable, I started to mimic them.
The practicing piece.
Yeah.
Did you enjoy it?
I loved it.
Like everything that you're learning, right? It's practice, it's dedication, it's like repetitions. That process, you enjoy it, like the musicality of it all. And then
I keep comparing hockey because it's just such a good mindset.
Yeah.
You know those kids that you have to drag off the rink to bring them in at night because they won't stop playing? Was that you?
Yeah.
Was that you?
Yeah.
Why?
Love it.
Why'd you love it?
Well, for me, because I was, it built confidence around myself because I was getting better at something. Yeah. It was also just this wild passion because, when you watch the Flames on TV, it's like, there's just the energy to it. So I didn't think about getting better per se. I just loved to do the thing. And then, oh, by the way, I'd love to do the thing and I got better at it.
Did you ever play professionally?
Oh, yeah. No.
Okay.
No.
I met Walter Gretzky. I actually went to Walter Gretzky's house. I've been to his house when he was alive. God bless that man.
Yep.
And I'm bringing it up not to name drop. I was speaking in the school that Walter Gretzky lived 6 blocks away from in Ontario.
Brampton?
Yeah, Brampton. Yeah. And the principal of the school that was bringing me in to speak was friends with Walter's. Walter came and heard my speech. And he came up to me afterwards and said, "You got to come over for coffee." And it turned out my son was with me that day, which was just incredible. And we go to Wayne Gretzky's old home.
Amazing.
And it was shocking to see the way this stereotype is, but it was their old home. He could have lived in a mansion. And then you go to the basement and you see the shrine to Wayne Gretzky. So, of course, you got to ask the question. Everybody asks Walter, tell the truth. What was this like? He said, "I didn't have anything to do with this." He's such a humble guy. Of course he did. But what he did, not just hold the stick for Wayne, He would let Wayne stay out till midnight playing
Yeah.
in the driveway or at the rink. Mom and Dad were so amazing to let me practice all the time. But it gets even better because there's more noise coming. Okay. So then I get into jazz because I love jazz, and there's a jazz band in the band system of Yorkton, Saskatchewan. So I got into the junior high school jazz band. I ended up being lead trombone in the junior high school jazz band because I was one of the best players in band.
So paint the picture of what this, the dedication around the practice. Like what is that actually like? So, you know, when you say that you're in the jazz band, you're one of the lead trombone person, like that doesn't just happen, right? Like
No.
what the actual work behind that?
If you've interviewed, I didn't get that far. If you've interviewed songwriters, they're a mystery to me. I've never written music. I could play music off the page, no problem, sheet music.
Yeah.
I could sight read. I don't know why. Had a brain like that, but I could never write. And you wonder, how do these people write music? Where does it come from? Well, I'm comparing it. In my case, I couldn't write it, but I could create it. I was creating things by playing on my trombone. That wasn't about playing the music that I had from school. That wasn't about even mimicking Glenn Miller or Tommy Dorsey. But I could mimic my own jazz, and I would just create. Can you imagine the power that had in the 1970s for a little boy with no arms who wasn't really given many opportunities by the world? And the world wasn't being cruel.
Yeah.
The world was just saying, you can't really do this. I was driven by ego, no question about it. The other thing that was wonderful, Yorkton, Saskatchewan, and people can look this up if they don't believe it. I don't know for sure it's on Google. I've actually never done this. Yorkton, Saskatchewan was known for being a hub of music festivals. Twice a year, we had a music festival. So you could compete. Well, I would compete, and I wanted to be in the trombone competitions, and I wanted to win. I still run into people that say, I remember you beat me, you know what? And you can see the look on their face. They haven't got over it because they got beat by the kid with no arms. And of course, enters the conversation, you won because they felt bad for you. Wrong answer. They didn't feel bad for me because you don't know music adjudicators. They don't care if you are purple. Can you play? In fact, that became a mantra of mine. Musician buddies of mine, they don't care what you look like. Can you play? And to be able to say, watch me, was fascinating. And yes, it was ego. But if you've ever created music by playing it, by being in a band, that was the critical part of this. Yeah, I could play in my basement. But oh my God, when I was in the band, I was with all these other people. And they weren't, that's Alvin, you know.
Yeah.
That was, hey, that's Alvin. There was no problem.
Yeah.
If anything, what annoyed my trombone section when I was the lead was expecting more of them. But Mr. McClary, Mrs. Burham, she was my other teacher, they loved that in me because I would push others to be better without actually saying anything. You know, it was almost like these other kids were going, geez, I better get my act together. The kid with no arms is beating me in competitions. Funny thing, huh? But what happened with that was I was basically a star on the rise. So the star on the rise gets the bonus round. You get to go to jazz camp in Fort Capel, Saskatchewan, Fort Sand, the music camp at Fort Sand, Saskatchewan. How they attracted some of the most incredible music teachers to Saskatchewan from everywhere else in the Americas was incredible. I had influence by these amazing instructors. We also had all these, it was like going to Disneyland for musicians. You were there for 2 weeks at a camp in the middle of rural Saskatchewan. And they had all these old buildings. This big, big building was an old TB clinic. So it was huge. And it had all these outbuildings that were like cottages. And they were all glass. So they had remarkable acoustics. So you'd practice in these rooms. So one day, our little jazz band was practicing. When everybody was done, I'm looking at the drum set, and I'm thinking, I want to try those. So I went up to the drum set, put a pair of sticks between my toes, and started banging on the drums. Was it a coincidence, Jeff? I don't know. Right then, the noise attracted the head drum instructor, who comes into the room looking like he was ready to give somebody you know what. And I'm playing, and the look on his face. I wish I would have had a camera like we carry around now, right? The look on his face, I'll always remember. He didn't get mad. He looked at me and he said, really? And then he went, effing really? And I went, what? He goes, I've never seen anybody do that. Where'd you learn to do that? I said, I haven't learned anything. I was just farting around. He goes, do you want me to teach you? His name was Jack Mouse. Anybody who knows anything about Jack Mouse would know this is a real story. We lost Jack last year to cancer, sadly. He was living in Iowa, I believe. Jack Mouse taught me the basics of playing a drum kit without being able to use the bass drum with my foot or the hi-hat with my other foot. He taught me to put the sticks between my toes, but even Jack said, there's no human way possible that you can hold those sticks and not drop them. Well, why were my feet so strong? Because I used my feet for everything. You know, all this fits together.
Oh, yeah.
So I start playing the drums. But I go home and say, I want a drum set. And my dad and mom are going, there's no way you're getting a drum set, you know? But we'll get you drum lessons. How about that? So then another guy comes into my life. His name's Eric Nikiforov. He still teaches music in North Dakota. He gave me lessons, but he started on snare drum. Actually, on practice pad. I wasn't allowed to play a kit unless I finished. This is a drum thing. The Stone Book of Rudiment Percussion. Look it up. The Stone Book of Rudiment Percussion. I learned all 26 rudiments, and I mastered them with my toes. Again, not thinking about this is amazing. I'm just thinking, I want to prove this to somebody. So then I started going to band festivals where I was playing trombone, and now I was also playing drums, snare drum, in competitions, but I got involved in other things. So then all of a sudden I had this fellowship, this group of people that I was growing up with, making music together. But more than anything, it was so fun. Every time I pulled those instruments out, it was like but here was the problem. I started believing I could be a professional musician. And that never happened.
Did it give you like a sense of purpose? Like being that,
Absolutely.
that like invested in music? Like when, you know, get up and you're like, this is kind of who I am. This is what I do. This is my passion. Like it was that kind of driver.
If you were to advance the frame on this entire story to our discussion about energy, my wife would say it was the most bountiful healing energy on the planet. And I agree.
Yeah.
I didn't have deep, dark issues as a teenager. I had lame ones, like anybody else would have. Zits, you know, or bad hair, those things. Girlfriends. I never dated. Girls wouldn't want to hold my foot. Duh. I mean, you know, duh. So I was jealous.
Yeah.
You know, I was envious of my buddies who were cool. But if you know real deep dive musicians that aren't attractive looking human beings, they don't, and I don't mean that to be mean. You know, some musicians are pretty good looking. I know Michael Bublé personally, right? Every time I see him, dude, you're such a good looking man. He is. He's a good looking man. I was not a good looking man. So therefore, if I wanted to attract attention into my world, music was the hook. But I didn't know what that was going to mean. In fact, there seemed to be a time frame that was closing and crunching in on me. Even to the point where in 1978, again, you can't make this stuff up, Mr. McClary didn't just change my life. There was a number, I don't know what that number looks like today because we've lost a few of these to mortality. There were over 200 people that graduated from the Yorkton music programs to become music directors of their own. One man inspired that in people. So I had that. What were the odds? We're not talking even Regina here or Calgary. We're talking Yorkton. What attracts a miracle-making music maker and band director to Yorkton and then puts a trombone on a chair and then encourages me to be the best? Well, he didn't just do it for me. We had some of the best bands in the history of Saskatchewan, to the point where we represented Saskatchewan in the Canadian National Jazz Band Competition. They call Music Fest now. And we got third in the nation. And I was chosen lead chair trombone for the Canadian National All-Star High School Jazz Band.
You can't even finish that sentence without smiling.
Because I still remember it.
It's so cool to see because you're just like, holy fuck.
If you can imagine these other instrumentation, the people that were playing their own instruments in the band, that was a stupid word.
My imagination is running.
We go to the band room. This was at the Winnipeg Convention Center. That's where the national competition was. So we had a day to rehearse. And this is where I'm going to get into a little bit of the real music aficionados will know this name. We were going to be backing up a guy who was the special guest of the finale concert named Maynard Ferguson. Maynard Ferguson was a French-Canadian trumpet player who was the moving force behind fusion jazz. Him and some of the names of the time. But he was screamer. He had this incredible lung capacity, and he could hit triple high notes in the triple range. As it turned out, I could hit triple high notes in the triple range on my trombone because I was trying to play as good as Maynard Ferguson. I had 12 of his albums. I could play all of his tunes. So they hand out the sheet music, and one of the songs is by Maynard Ferguson, and I've played it at home 1,000 times. And in the middle of this song, we have the original score from Maynard Ferguson, okay? So we have the sheet music that's been printed, but we have notes that he's written in the margins. And there's this one 24-bar section that says, trombone solo as per the solo on Conquistador, which is an album. I'd played it 100 times. But if you can imagine, I go into the first jazz rehearsal for this national band, and I'm the lead chair. And I got a buddy who's helping me carry my chair in and put my trombone on the chair so I can play it with my foot. And everybody in the band's going, what the hell is going on here? Well, of course, I didn't have any problem. I was confident. But the really funniest part of the story is my buddy that was with me was also from Yorkton. He was also in the All-Star Band, and he was the bass trombone player. He was my best friend. Nice. And we also had the lead trumpet player from our band, Yorkton's band, in that band as well as lead trumpet. So we were like a coup in the music sections other than the saxophones, right? Point is, the other guys were having more fun than I was because they knew what was going to happen next. They knew that the rest of the trombone section in particular was A, going to be put in their place, but B, if they were good people, they would celebrate. And that's exactly what happened. Maynard Ferguson wasn't in the room, but when this solo section came up and I played it perfect the first time, the trombone section actually clapped, and then the band clapped. And to be quite blunt about this, I loved that.
Yeah.
It was, what a horribly egotistical moment, but I loved it. It was like these musicians were going, way to go, pal. Mm-hmm. That can take you an awfully long way in life. The trouble with too many people to kind of now take the opposite approach to this, they peak in high school.
Yep.
I did not. That was the key. Now, I didn't peak. I did in music, in terms of trombone, but I didn't peak on the drums in high school. I got a pretty cool story about drums when we get to it. But to finish this segment off, because I was lead chair trombone, I got offers of 7 scholarships to go study music in the States, including 3 of the biggest universities. I didn't go.
Was high school like all just music through and through? Was it just this was it the thing? And was there something else that kind of had your...
No, that was it.
That was it.
That was it. Well, there was a choir.
Yep.
I was in jazz choir.
But like music.
I was in concert choir, all music. Drama. Yep. I was in musicals. But again, I was willing to be a big boy. I could have easily had the lead role in several of our very high quality musicals. In fact, I just had this thought. It just popped in my head. In 7th grade, picture this again, the story of Alvin Law. I earned the part, but I played Snoopy in You're a Good Man, Charlie Brown, the musical that we did in 7th grade. I was the tap dancer. So I did the supper time dance. They built me a doghouse that I could dance on. I had a soprano voice from church choir, so I could sing the supper time song, which is an incredible song. And I got a standing ovation, which kind of annoyed my classmates. But, this was, again, Yorkton going, that's our boy.
Yep.
It was incredible. I thought I could be in acting. It didn't occur to me. But, I had to face the cold reality. This becomes political discussion now for too many people. I get a little fussy, to be quite frank, when people say, I don't see representation in the media for me. Well, I'm sorry, kiddie, get over it. I know that's harsh, really harsh. It was funny. My wife and I were watching the silliest thing the other day, probably closer to 3 or 4 months ago, watching, one of the Wheel of Fortunes, and they had a Disney theme, and they had a black lady who said she wanted to be Cinderella, literally. And I'm thinking, good for you, girl. You're black and you want to be Cinderella. You're not copping this. I guess I can't because I'm black. So she was. She was Cinderella in a school musical. Good for her. But the idea that we take it to the negative vibe and say there isn't the proper representation of me in media, I agree, kind of. But if I was worrying about trying to find representation in the media for guys with no arms, I'd be, out of luck. Although ironically, talk about jumping into another story, I actually played an armless preacher on an episode of X-Files.
No way.
I was an armless preacher on the episode was called Humbug, season 2, 1996. It's on Netflix still, I think. They were looking for an armless actor, of all things, because the episode was written by a really, really talented writer who was one of the lead writers on X-Files. And he wanted to take a little bit of liberty, which they were getting into because they didn't think the season... People don't know this. They thought X-Files was going to be 1 season. And then they ran out of storylines. So they had to start creating new ones. And this one guy wrote a storyline based on the sideshow circuits that happen in Scotland. And that's where you see the freaks, right? The people that are all tatted up on their entire body, or they twist their body into things. I mean, my God, the Enigma was in the X-Files episode. He had tattoos all over his entire body. Another guy by the name of Jim Rose is famous in the sideshow circuits. His claim for fame, again, spoiler alert, he could twist his dick in a knot. Are you going to keep that one in the story?
Yeah, there's no editing in this thing.
And what's funny about that is getting around those people was kind of weird because they were there acting in the episode, but they needed to be accurate to the representation of the storyline, which is happening in a place called Gibsonton, Florida, which is literally the retirement community for the Barnum and Bailey sideshow freaks that lost their jobs because of politically correct, right? Again, I'm not judging. I'm just saying there's a real story about this. And of course, the writer takes some liberties and he creates an episode where one of the freaks dies in the swimming pool, killed by another freak, and they got to figure out who the murderer is. And Scully and Mulder come to town, and they're the only ones that aren't freaks, which makes them their own freaks. There's a movie from 1923 called Freaks, based on that idea. Anyway, I got the part of the armless preacher because I happened to be in Vancouver guest hosting for the Variety Show of Hearts Telethon, which I do every year and had for 35 years. And they saw me doing a bit. Just so happens one of the producers of the show was channel surfing. Again, how does things happen to Alvin Law? Channel surfing on a Sunday afternoon when he's not shooting, but they're living in Vancouver because that's where they shot it. Comes across the telethon, sees this guy on TV dialing a push-button telephone with his toes to show the audience how easy it is to phone in and donate to Variety. He gets on the phone right away, wants to reach me, they won't let him pass the gatekeeper. He actually had to make a donation so that he could get somebody to pass the phone call on to me. I phoned them, and I couldn't get a hold of the guy. I was off to another engagement. Go to this engagement. My wife phones me the next day. She goes, by the way, I finally got a hold of this guy named Rob Bowman. I don't know. It's kind of like a really weird thing. It sounds like one of those faith healer shows. It's something religious. I don't know. It's called Exiles or something like that. She says, here's the phone number. So I literally phone it, and it is Los Angeles, their studio number, and they answer, Fox Television, X-Files, how may I direct your call? Rob Bowman, please. I get Rob Bowman on the phone, and I find out he wants me for the part of this preacher on X-Files. So I did it. I got a credit on the show and everything.
Wow.
So one could say, did I then want to become an actor? Hell no. That was like going to a party. That's all it was. It was so fun. But, that's been my life, man. Opportunities always seem to present themselves because I think I live in the right mindset.
Which is what? Do you, and so...
I believe the world is a miracle, and we're all miracles. And I don't say that religiously. I think we give ourselves way little credit for how incredible our lives are, and the places we get to go see. And it's not about even traveling, okay? Calgary has its drawbacks. We've gotten sucked into the political hole, but this is a remarkable city. It's a beautiful city. Who gets to live at the edge of the Rocky Mountains, man?
Yeah.
But so many people complain about, and I do it, I'm guilty, complain about the traffic, complain about snow removal. Got it. When you grow up without arms, you find out complaining doesn't get you anywhere. So you're always looking at the silver lining in everything. And that's just my nature.
You could have the choice not to think like that.
You could.
And do you think that's your mom and dad?
Yeah.
That's kind of where the foundation they kind of set.
Well, it was what I saw in living proof.
Yeah.
Because mom and dad, they were social butterflies. They didn't look like social butterflies because they were blue collar family. What I mean by that is they weren't partying at the Ritz, Yeah. But I never saw my dad drunk. One time he had too many drinks. They went to a off-site party in Yorkton somewhere, and I watched my dad come home tipsy. I know when I've seen him that one time. But what I grew up with was parties. Having parties at our house. Oh God, I can't believe I'm going to tell this story because it's so wrong. Mom and Dad used to allow drinking parties in our basement with my high school friends. And in 1975, 1976, my dad was already starting the practice of taking people's cars, their keys, putting them in a cup, and then driving all my friends home at 3, 4 o'clock in the morning because he didn't want anybody to drink and drive. Who has parents like that?
Aggressive.
Right? Especially this would have been when they were in their late 60s, early 70s, okay? Therefore, everybody loved mom and dad. Therefore, I mean, I know it sounds like I'm painting a world of perfection. It wasn't. It was hard. We had conflicts. Mom and dad were tough on me. I didn't fully appreciate them until I got to be older. Who does? But the reality was I was embracing being alive rather than mourning the curse of what happened.
Yeah.
That's a huge thing. And I'm not trying to suggest this is an easy thing to do.
Yeah.
I would never say this to any of your listeners, get over it. That's just rude.
Yeah.
Some people have genuine mental health issues surrounding their challenges, and they're legit. But the other thing about this, there is an outlet. It's called asking for help.
Just the option to go down this path, right?
Yeah.
Like, and obviously it's kind of put you on a path for a lot of years, but like you could easily have, you and I aren't sitting here, or if we are, it's a different tone, right? Like,
sure.
It takes energy to stay on this path and continue to feel this way.
It's why I didn't sink my teeth into what I would call disability activism.
Yeah.
Advocacy, absolutely, but not activism.
Yeah.
And I don't mean any disrespect this. I honest to God, this from the bottom of my heart. But I've met way too many activists in everything that are just mad.
Yeah.
And you feel it. You get around me, you go, I can't be around you anymore.
Yeah, for sure.
And that's fine. That's your choice.
Yeah.
And to be quite blunt, it is a choice. It's a choice driven by our past stories. And I want to acknowledge that. There's some pretty bad past stories. But as an example, okay, and again, this may offend people. I apologize. But I vividly remember my father saying when I was young, you won't have to work in the sideshows, Alvin, because we don't do that anymore. And that was a mindset. It was huge, right? We did it. It was terrible. What we used to do to disabled people, let alone First Nations people, I get that. We need to acknowledge these stories. But at the same time, and this is just my opinion, here's a little line that I wrote many, many years ago. I stopped using it because it just got old. But the idea was when we drive our cars, we have a couple of different pieces of glass in front of us. One big one that we look forward, one little tiny one we look backwards. If all we do is look in the little one and look backwards, we're going to run into something.
Yep.
We need to continue to scan the rearview mirror every now and then, but focus our attention on moving forward because that's what moves people.
Agreed. Coming out of high school, where were you? Where was your? Did you have a vision? Do you have ideas of what you wanted to do? What was going on with Alvin?
One of the signature Alvin Law stories that actually is not an old one; it's a newer one. That was actually created during COVID. It was a real story, but it didn't have the body that it has now. I will often ask an audience, what did you want to be? What did you want to be? Let me ask you before I answer your question. What did you want to be? Do you remember? Did you have a guidance counselor?
Oh, I was a mind twist for guidance counselors.
Were you?
Oh, yeah.
Were you messed up?
No, I was just like, so guidance counselor for high school, what do you want to do? Well,
Yeah.
fuck, I can barely pass a class.
Yeah.
What can I do?
Right.
So that was the question.
So I created this storyline. It's actually quite funny if you think about it. I created the storyline. First time ever, I swear this is true, Canadian National Conference for High School Guidance Counselors in Toronto. 1,700 guidance counselors. And I'm their keynote. And I get up and the first story I tell is, what did you guys want to be? Do you remember your guidance counselor when you were in school? How many of you are doing what your guidance counselor told you to do in life? 1,700 people, 7 people put up their hand. So of course I said, I realized what that just looked like. I am not indicting guidance counselors. I'm saying the reality of life at 17, 18 years old is not real. It is a fabrication that we can make up our mind at 18 years old to know what to do. But let me tell you a story about my guidance counselor. And that's how I segued into the story without insulting them, because I wanted to make sure they understood I am with you today, Jeff. Yes, because of Jack and Hilda Law and Blaine McClary and Yorkton. But I'm really here today because of my guidance counselor, Ken Sherwin. I absolutely believe this. So imagine now I am in high school. I am one of the best trombone players in Canada. And I'm not exaggerating. So I figure my path is moving forward, but I've also become a remarkably good drummer. I mean, that's what I was really, really good at, was playing the drums. It just happened that way. Of course, I also spent hours and hours in my basement with that old Fleetwood stereo playing to bands like Rush, which was impossible. I wanted to be Neil Peart. And by the way, I got a chance to get to know Rush. That's a whole other story. See, there are all so many stories. Do we have enough time? Anyway, I go into my guidance counselor's office, and that's why this story is so powerful. I remember it like it was yesterday, sitting in front of his desk, like, this is such a waste of my time, is what my brain is saying. But I had also been taught to respect my elders. Remember the old school, respect your elders? Yeah, I did, because I had elders. A lot of them. I said to Mr. Sherwin, what are we going to talk about? He goes, your plan after graduation. We have to talk about this. It's my job to do this, but also I think you need some guidance. And I went, thank you. I appreciate your guidance, but I know what I'm going to do. And this is exactly what I said, Jeff. I'm going to be a rock star. And I believed I was going to be a rock star. Not necessarily a Led Zeppelin rock star, but something to do with music. Because that was my plan. Look how good I was at it. What I didn't think about was I was good at it in Yorkton.
Right.
Would I be good at it at Juilliard? Would I be good at it at the Royal Music Conservatory? Would I? Well, I don't know. But Mr. Sherwin's job was to be the balance, okay? So he said, I know you could be a rock star. We love you, Alvin, what you've done with your life. You know, even I'm impressed. But I'm here to be your voice of reason, to talk you away from the ledge. Have you any other plans? And again, I don't make any stories up. These are stories that I've written along the lines that are just mimicking my real life. I literally said, okay, and I'm a foot user, right? I said, how about dentistry? Can you imagine? Open wider. I don't think so. So Mr. Sherwin says, are you trying to be funny? And I went, trying. And he goes, Mr. Law, if anybody understands this, you should. Life isn't funny. See, that's a very interesting line, isn't it? Because that was something that I knew. I knew life wasn't funny, but funny was more fun, you know, not inappropriate funny, just seeing the humor in things, seeing the laughing at people looking at me funny. You know, of course it's funny. Anyway, I said, okay, seriously then, what do you think I should do? This is when my life changed, literally. He says, I think you should be a broadcaster. I went, like on television? He says, no, you're too ugly for television. He could say that because we weren't politically correct, and he was right. You're not old enough to remember the 1970s anchors on television. They were like Ken and Barbie dolls. They weren't journalists, right? He was right. I had too many imperfections, but I also had too many distractions using my feet. But he said, you could be great in radio. Radio. I never, ever thought of that. How do I do that? He goes, you go to school. Where do I go to school for that? Well, there's two in the country that I've looked into that are the best in Canada. One's in Toronto called Ryerson. The other's a place called Mount Royal College in Calgary, Alberta. He says, I think you should think about getting into Mount Royal in Calgary. He says, I said, that's like 10 hours away. He goes, I know. Can you handle it? Now, I want your audience to picture this, please. In 1977, I couldn't go to the bathroom without help. I could take care of my sanitary needs. We'll leave that one alone. But I literally needed help with my pants. Today, I don't. I have a whole wardrobe of specially purchased clothing that has elastic waistbands that allow me to dress myself using pretty sophisticated yoga moves and knobs on drawers. I'll let your audience try to imagine that. But the reality was I needed help going to the bathroom. And I was going to leave Yorkton to go to Calgary. No, the dreamy side of me went, cool. The reality part of my brain went, how am I going to do this? But that's exactly what I did, Jeff.
77.
78, I moved to Calgary.
Wow.
Moved to Glenmorgan, moved to go to school at Mount Royal where there was no dorms. Drove my 1974 Hornet Sportabout station wagon 10 hours.
Sweet ride.
Had my drum set in the back of my vehicle because that was the one thing I never, ever left behind. Put it in the basement of our rental unit. I was a room and board with two other guys. And here's a great example. And again, this is going to sound skewed, but I don't want it to be anything but real. I'd never met a black person except George Reed, who played football for the Saskatchewan Roughriders. And one of my roommates was from Nigeria. Talk about a reality check. But he was also on his way to becoming a medical student. So his helping me with my clothing was no problem. But we became close friends. And I kept shaking my head going, how did I end up becoming friends with someone with black skin? Well, because I wasn't looking at the black skin. And he wasn't looking at the fact that I had no arms because that's what the kind of people we were. So that was the crowd I hung out with in college. But not only did I graduate in 1980 with honors from Mount Royal College, my first job was as a FM classic rock vinyl DJ at FM 92 in Regina, Saskatchewan in 1980. It was called FM 92, the Rock of Regina. And my major inspiration, here's a good one, CJ92 in Calgary.
Was Jerry working?
Absolutely. I love those guys. And I'm going to be really, really candid about this. I figured if I could go to work, get stoned, and have a job, that's for me. Now, I don't know if that was what they were doing, but they sure sounded stoned. Now, I'm kidding, of course, but the reality was it just sounded like so much fun.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what I did for a year. I had fun being a rock and roll DJ. But then fate would come along and tear me away because I had the opportunity to be a speaker for the United Nations International Year of Disabled Persons in 1981. So I quit my radio job in Regina and started traveling around schools in Alberta, out of Wetaskiwin, with a buddy who had cerebral palsy. We were actually called United Nations ambassadors. We had little buttons on our shirts and jackets that we got from the UN because this guy had received a big government grant to conduct awareness seminars in Alberta schools. I have a question. How many people in their audience that are maybe watching this right now have seen me come to your school and speak? Okay. And part of what I did in those days was not to adopt the negativity approach to disability, because the idea of the United Nations Declaration was to promote awareness of the positive nature of people's abilities.
Which you didn't have to fake it, right?
Didn't have to fake it.
There's just kind of that's how you present it and that's how you feel.
First thing kids would see me do, I concocted this and it's still in play to this day on occasion with schools. I got the audience to close their eyes. And then I played the crap out of a drum. And then I got them to open their eyes and I'd play the crap out of the drum again. And then I would finish and they would clap and go nuts. Today they video record it. And then I would say, so here's the question. When your eyes were closed, did it sound like I had no arms? With your eyes open, what did I look like? Did it look like a handicapped person or did it look like a drummer? Because I'm a drummer. And then I'm a handicapped person, if you believe that. But let's talk about why I'm not one of those either. So that was 1981. We were way ahead of the curve in terms of what we talk about today. But I don't know if you've had any Paralympians in this chair.
No. My experience with para-athletes is in water skiing.
Okay, really?
As obscure as that sounds, the club that I'm a member at, they have this adaptive program.
Cool.
So I was riding in the boat with an athlete, holding the rope, because if they crash, you got to let go of the rope so they doesn't, get dragged down the lake. So I'm like up close and personal with the water ski adaptive program. So yes.
Oh, well, then I have to tell you this story. True story again. Crystal Lake, Saskatchewan, 1979, I believe it was. I was in between first and second year of college at Mount Royal, and I go out to our cottage to spend a little bit of a long weekend away from my part-time job I had at the Yorkton radio station doing news and sports. And my family, which are not close to me per se because I grew up as an only child, but I still do have in those days 2 brothers with kids my age. It was creepy. I had kids older than me that called me uncle. One of them, if you're listening, Scott Law, he was the biggest thug I ever met in my entire life, and he literally he got all of the stuff out of me that was annoying, because I was annoying. I was a bit of a wimp. And of course, I was a big fan of a group called Chicago, and my nephew Scott was a big fan of a group called Kiss. And he wanted to indoctrinate me into Kiss and get me away from jazz. So he was but he was also a rugby player, and he understood the kind of the group culture of rugby. And he would let me hang out with his rugby friends, but he says, I'm not going to let you hang out with them if you continue to be a wimp. So he unwimped me. And one of the ways he unwimped me one day was tied the business end of the ski rope that would go to the boat around my waist with a belt that was a floating belt. And he sat in the back of the boat and held the handle. And we went out onto the lake, and I got up on 2 skis, and I went 75 feet before I realized what the hell I was doing. And then I fell, and like you, Scott forgot to let go of the rope, so guess what happened next? I'm tied to the boat, and I'm being dragged along the bottom of the lake, probably a good 50 feet. I had the sense to keep my breath in, and then realized, how am I going to get out of this? Well, as soon as he realized what was going on, it wasn't that he dropped the rope, it's that the spotter saw me fall and stopped the boat. At that point, the momentum of the boat stopped, and my floaty brought me back up to the surface, and everybody was in the boat a mixture of complete shock and then complete laughing. And then, of course, we went back to the cabin and drank the rest of the day. Those are the kind of things I would never suggest you try. Don't do this at home. But imagine how those things shaped me.
Yeah.
We're sitting around the lake at a campfire at Crystal Lake in 1990, 1980, 2015. The story always comes up. Remember that time? I don't think I would have become the person I am if I would have wimped out.
Yeah.
And it wasn't that I was doing something I realized was smart. It was totally stupid.
Yeah.
But I wasn't afraid to try stuff. If I die, I die. I know that's crude, but you got, that's what people in extreme sports understand too.
Yeah.
And they are a different breed of people.
Yeah.
And I know a few of them. And I love them because they're not going to sit back and go, I don't want to try that. I might get hurt. Risk and reward.
For sure. When you leave the radio and you start doing the speaking stuff.
Yeah.
Was it you said it earlier, like you just kind of, you had the energy, right? You were confident, you were fine, just like not being the center of attention, but you were fine being an extrovert. Did the speaking thing click with you early? Like, did it do something for you?
First of all, it wasn't a thing yet. We didn't have, Zig Ziglar was kind of in his infancy as one of the big leaders in terms of speaking culture.
Yeah.
There was no Tony Robbins, to use a word that people might be familiar with.
Yeah.
There was no industry. So really what I was doing more than anything was being like a guest lecturer on a topic that was uncomfortable for society. But what happened as a result of the experience in Alberta was the year ended, and therefore the grant ended, and therefore the work ended. But before the work ended, I set myself up because I knew that I had to find something to do. And in fact, I kind of left my buddy Lee out in a bit of a lurch because I left early because I was offered a job doing the same exact program in Saskatchewan. But I was invited to join an organization that was then called the Saskatchewan Council for Crippled Children and Adults. It was a company, a nonprofit agency that owned 5 workshops across Saskatchewan. Bit of controversy today, but not then, where they brought in mostly dysfunctional, mentally handicapped adults, a lot of people with Down syndrome, a lot of people with brain injury, some physically handicapped, but mostly people with brain injury. And they were making stuff, the old stereotype of making mugs and making wood stuff. It was controversial because, of course, it was viewed as being wrong by today's standards. But in those days, it was different. They had a desire to become much more community aware, but they didn't have anybody doing it. So when this guy that originally, actually, my first claim to fame came when I became Saskatchewan's Easter Seals Timmy, which we would today call an ambassador, or in America they would call it a poster child. But I got to be that in 76 and 77. So I started actually being a part of advocacy even then. It was a little different because it was a function of the organization.
Yep.
But we had a relationship going back to 76, 77. Guy's name was Gord Tanner. So when Gord Tanner found out I was doing this, I was speaking at another event in Saskatoon that he came to, and basically we went for a drink afterwards. He said, if you're ever out of a job, I'll hire you. And that's exactly what happened. So I got on with this organization. One of the things I'm very proud of was being a big part of changing the name from the Council for Crippled Children and Adults to what we then named the Saskatchewan Abilities Council. And today in Saskatchewan, those workshops are still there, and they're now called Saskabilities. Amazing. And again, the vibe in these buildings is tricky because it's full of people that have mentally challenging lives, but they've got function.
Yeah.
They're feeling like they're doing something. As patronizing as people want to be about it, I'm sticking up for them because it makes a difference in these folks' lives. But in 1982, there was so little awareness.
Yeah.
And I'm going to use this word again, mojo was what the Abilities Council loved. I was going out and representing, but I was taking my school awareness program and tweaking it to being about community and the importance of community and how we're all in this together and all the code words. And then the big thing that changed again, all these events, I don't know how you feel about your life events, but 1985, another big one comes along when just so happens that Yorkton, Saskatchewan, during the International Year of Youth, is having their first ever national leadership convention at my high school in Yorkton. Just stuff that happened in my life you can't make up. Well, I get invited to go speak at it because I'm a grad of the high school, but I was also the only Canadian leadership speaker. All I did was tweak my message about disability awareness into one about leadership. I did that gig. I actually had a real job then, I call it, because I'm joking, right? I went from Abilities Council into advertising. I got into being an ad executive. It's just something that was offered me. I know people that were a big ad agency. If you're ever looking for a job, you hear those things?
Yep.
I thought, I'll give it a try. I was tired of the nonprofit. Had a baby coming. 1985, he was born. And changed jobs. I loved it. But that led to a government job eventually. I'm not avoiding where I was going with this. In 1988, I got real tired of being a government bureaucrat trying to manage a department for disability hiring in the government of Saskatchewan. We called it the Disability Directorate, which was a job that was offered to me by the Premier of Saskatchewan. Pretty cool, big ego. But the point is, in 85, I was invited to be the speaker in Yorkton. And of course, there were, 1,000 kids there from all across Canada. I actually literally got invitations within the next 2 weeks to over 175 schools to come and speak in person. My boss in the ad agency was awesome. Let me go. I kept growing my speaking business to where in 1988, I finally was doing so much on the side that I quit my government job and I became a full-time speaker. And I probably did about 2,000 school assemblies before I moved to Calgary in 2000. So I've been around a lot. And that skill set that came from the entertainment side of my life continued to be the skill set I used in developing my speaking material. I'm not a stand-up comic. That's not what I am. But I'm not a moody, negative, here's the reality of the world, because that's not what works.
Yeah.
And that translated into adult leadership, which translated into, the next biggest change of my life was in 1991 when I met my now wife. I was a single dad to a 3-year-old, and my ex-wife had mental health issues, and she wasn't allowed to take care of the child. That's a whole other story we don't need to talk about today. But that changed my life too, because I met a woman in 91 who would end up becoming my partner in business that married me in 1993. So that story alone would be probably, if we're arguing about significant stories, we all have partner stories, spouse stories, I suppose. Mine is equally powerful. Again, changed my life when I got to be with somebody that could reframe what drove me. That it wasn't just disability and it wasn't just awareness. It was my creativity. I'm a performer, man. That's what I do.
Well, you've always known it too.
I've always known it.
What brought you to Calgary in 2000?
My son was a burgeoning genius on the various levels of music on his own, playing woodwind, saxophones, all of them. And his band director, Brent Giglione, another name I want to recognize, in Regina, recommended that he go into music full time. We also had his mother recover from her institutional care, but was still not balanced. And at some point, my wife and I decided, look, we need to leave Regina. There's too much of that influence because she gets to see him, because that was our choice. We didn't want to take his mother away from him. But his mother was a very negative individual, very, very violent, addictions, things like that. So when we looked at the calendar, 2000 seemed to be the right year, because Vance would have been going from grade 9 in Regina to grade 10 in Calgary. And we moved to Sundance because he would go to Beaverbrook, which had two of the most profoundly influential musical people ever. And those were Vance's band directors. And Vance ended up going deep dive into music. He was so good at it that he went to Grant MacEwan College in he graduated 2003. But here's where the rubber hits the road, to use that old cliche. I had talent, but I had passion. My son had talent and no passion. So he didn't even make it through first year. Quit music school. And today he's a power engineer. So 39, single. We've had our own journey that's been tough. Single dad, tough childhood. A lot of things that obviously would come into play in terms of having a dad with no arms. But my son, my God, I think if I'm going to ask the audience to think of a question, do you feel blessed by your children or cursed by them? And that's a terrible statement to make. But boy, if everybody was lucky as I was, having the parents I grew up with, and Vance was so lucky to have me and his dad and Darlene as his mom, you got pretty lucky too, because we understood the importance of how to try to do the best with your kids, to give them every opportunity. But that doesn't mean hovering over them. Doesn't mean, all these cliches we've come up with snowplow parents. If anything, I learned the harsh reality of my life by having no arms. And Vance learned the harsh reality of his life by having a mentally unhealthy mom and a dad with no arms. He understands reality completely.
The path you've been on with the speaking, was it continue, and you're on right now, is it always evolving, or is it does it evolve with you? Does it evolve based on experiences?
I think the issue with the evolution of speaking was incredibly impacted, who wasn't, by COVID. I can do virtual events. I'm able to be in front of a camera in my living room, which is my iPad. I can, and I'm virtually certified, so I'm professional at that. But I draw every comparison in my speaking business to the same business of entertainment. You know, we all know what a difference it makes to go and see a live band versus watching one on TV. I mean, you know, we can all have our opinions, let's say about Taylor Swift, for example. I think Taylor Swift is incredible. I think the gift she gave to the world with her show, to see those young people, let's put aside all the discussion about ticket prices and all the politics. Oh my God, to have that kind of experience in your life, to be able to be in a place where you're entertaining 50,000 people from a stage. I spoke in front of 37,000 people in Uganda for a special event for Rotary International, where they were having a concert in support of their blood bank, which they run in Uganda. It's run by the Rotary. Being in front of 37,000 people in this case, cricket stadium, was the biggest ego hit I've ever had in my entire life. And I wanted more. So I think that was the issue, and is still the issue with the events industry. We haven't gone back yet. They are still trying to figure out how to manage having people in the same building together, because there's still a threat of COVID, let's be honest. But I think what happened too is, I'm just going to say it, people took the easy way out.
For sure.
Oh, we don't want to put on a big event with 1,200 people at the convention center. Let's just make them sit in front of their TV or in front of their screen or in front of their device. Well, what kind of fun is that? That's not fun. That's sitting in front of your computer, again, for another hour, doing what? So yeah, it's going to take a while for it to recover. But like this conversation we're having, you and me together, that's what it's all about. The speaking business is about being inspired by somebody, no matter what their story is. And it has different faces. Some of them are big faces, you know, like the Tony Robbins of the world. And some of them are faces that we don't even know about. And to be quite honest about this again, and I don't want to be harsh, the TED Talks didn't help. Because people can now go on their device and watch a talk and figure that's going to be the experience. It's not the same as being in person, like anything else. So I get a little weird about this because it's close to home. It's been a hard recovery. I was used to doing well over 125 gigs a year, and 2024 has been brutal. But 2025 is, again, rebounding a bit. I think people are finally starting to understand what they missed. You know, again, we're sitting in the back room of a great restaurant. Yeah, order your skip the dishes if you really want to do that, but don't be lame. Come to this beautiful place and experience the in-person dining experience, which is what restaurants were created for in the first place. It's the same with speaking.
It's like you're an entrepreneur. It's just like business. You're trying to grow. It's like it's the same. It's the same pros or the opportunities and tough times as any business owner, right? Like you're kind of managing, trying to manage within this market. It does come back. It's just, how long can you hang on, right? It's just like any business owner, right? Like same as me, right? How long can you hang on until things just start working?
The other thing that happened is through evolution of speaking is like the evolution of training. You know, it's out there. A lot of your listeners would be familiar if they've ever had to go to a training thing or some kind of course where they had to take. By the way, a course is code for improvement. That's what these are all about. You know, we're not forcing these things on you, because we hate you. We want you to be better at what you do. We want you to be more experienced at what you do. So we're going to bring in somebody that knows how to teach you about that. And a training course can be 5 days, 8 hours a day. That's not what I do. I am that person they bring in to be the keynote speaker, to provide I call it comedic relief, like a Shakespeare play. But more than anything, to take us back to the human index. You know, there's something very special about that and what that brings to it. And that's what I've always tried to do. I'm not up there going, look what I can do. Aren't you impressed? I'm saying, look what I can do. Now, why can't you? That's not as direct as I would say it. But I think we all need to, not be more egotistical, not be more full of ourselves, but to experience the life we've been given. To have an opportunity to do things that you kind of go, oh, that was so cool. I reached out and tried doing something that I never thought I'd be able to do. And I gave it a shot, and thank God it worked out. And unfortunately, we also live in a world of the immediate gratification. I don't want to get into that portal. But that's another thing that I think I've always been patient, because the world was not ready for an Alvin Law. So I had to make the world ready for me to be able to do things. And I'm still doing it. You know, can you imagine just a subtle little thing? I drive. That's how I got down here today, right? Nobody's with me. I drive a regular vehicle. I steer with my right foot on the wheel, my left foot on the gas. All I need is automatic transmission. And I often like to joke, can you imagine the look you get when you pull up at a drive-through? So I always loved the humor line, right? The look you get. And then my wife said to me one day, "Okay, seriously, can you imagine what that looks like?" I said, "Well, what am I supposed to do?" "Well, tell them." So now when I get up to say, name dropping now, whether it's McDonald's or Tim Hortons, I get up to the booth where I'm ready to pay and I go, "By the way, I've got no arms. I have to give you my debit card or my cash with my toes. I hope you don't mind." To be quite frank about this again, I've had people tell me the 30-second conversation at a drive-through window changed them because they took a look at a guy with no arms driving with his feet, okay with that, but more than anything, having a little bit of fun with it.
Yeah.
Of course, the funnier line is, it's even funnier if you're in the car behind me, because you can imagine watching me stick my foot out the window to grab my drink and my bag of food, and away I go. Again, humor.
Yeah.
But more than anything, you know what? We're pretty lucky to be here.
Yeah.
You know, and I think we just need to remember that.
Which is an interesting segue. I've been on this, like, the last little bit, I've been on this, like, funk kind of. You know, like, some things just aren't clicking quite right, or I'm not feeling inspired, or, usually around work stuff.
Yep.
Things just aren't quite clicking, right? As you said, 2024 hit, not like a downturn for you. How do you manage that? How do you manage that, like, that downward kind of momentum that, it's not ongoing, but when you're in a dip, what's your move to kind of, and I'm not just saying work related, just when you're in a dip, what's your move to kind of get out of it?
Well, two things. First of all, as silly as this sounds, I've got a plaque in my bathroom. Again, not to try and create too many weird images for your audience, but get up first thing in the morning. Where do I go? You go to the bathroom.
Yeah.
I don't stand to go to the bathroom. I'll leave your imagination up to that one. By the way, boys and men, stop standing to pee because your aim sucks. Anyway, I sit down and I have a little plaque that was given to me in 1981 when I was on my original tour. This was in Saskatchewan. A lady wanted to give me a gift and she laminated a card, a greeting card.
Yeah.
And the words are there, and I had them in my bathroom in every place I've lived since 1981. It's the first thing I see first thing in the morning. I don't look at my phone. I don't look at the news. I don't Google what's happening in the world. I look at my plaque, and it says, "I'm not afraid of tomorrow, for I have seen yesterday, and I love today." I learned through time to live in the moment, that other cliche. But more than anything, I've been around a long time.
Yeah.
So I've seen the cycles of the speaking business. And my wife and I now, together since 91, have also seen the cycles of the speaking business. Do you know the bigger hit to our society for speaking was not in 2021 or 22. It was actually in 2009 and 2010, following the big economic meltdown. Because the word has it, this is a not accurate number, but it's an assumed number. A buddy of mine that does statistics out of Germany figured this one out. 60 to 80,000 people lost their C-suite jobs, executive floor jobs, those 2 years, all over the world. Those people, guess what they learned to do? Speaking, training. So they went out into the wilderness where there was just the right balance of the number of speakers and upset the balance. They're still out there. Although COVID did kind of cull, to use a terrible word, a lot of people that couldn't make it through. I've just seen the cycles. Yeah. So whenever my wife sit down and we look at the state of our economy in our home right now, for example, we know it's been a lean year. Yep. We also know when we look at the calendar coming up in 2025, it's starting to pick up. But I've learned not to let any of the negative cycles go straight into my head and drive me crazy, because I have a pretty tender balance for mental health. I can easily let the reality of the lack of busyness, but it's not about the ego that I'm not getting work, and it's not even just the lack of income. It is the imbalance in my life. My wife keeps looking at me. Shouldn't you be going somewhere?
Yeah, you're still here.
Yeah, because that's what I do. It's like a rock band not having a gig to go to, right? I don't mean this disrespectfully, but why do you think all these bands are making reappearances in places like casinos? Yeah. Because that's who's hiring them now. You know, these aren't bands that are playing huge full Rogers Place stadiums. They're playing the Grey Eagle Casino, and good for them.
Yep.
And good for Grey Eagle. But you know what I mean? Like, we've had to do that.
Yep.
So I've had to do whatever I got to do. You know, do a lot more podcasts, do a lot more outreach, get a hold of organizations that might be looking for speakers. I've never had to do that. But I think it's not because I'm desperate. It's because I have to have something to do.
Yeah.
I can't just sit and watch television or read a book, you know, as much as that sounds great. But I also think part of what's creeping into my head, which I'm sure you're not thinking this yet, Jeff, I'm 64.
Yeah.
That enters your brain. You know, 65, 66, the classic change of life from working to retirement. People say, are you going to retire? I'll never retire. What am I going to do? Right? I'll always do this. So I always put into play the reminder, as that expression goes, this too shall pass.
Yeah.
And I just have belief. It's not a faith per se. It's not I pray. It's that I just feel like I've just got to hang in through this downturn and we'll have another upturn.
Yeah.
And you know what? You can't make people phone you. You've just got to hope for the best.
Yeah.
And if you're doing things, this isn't why I came to see you today. This has nothing to do with that. This has to do with keeping my brain active, my creativity in play. But more than anything, as my wife said, God, it feels good that you're going out and doing something today. And thank you for that, because it means a lot to me.
Thanks for doing this.
You're welcome.
Really cool to meet you, obviously. Professional storyteller, obviously.
Thanks.
These are very interesting experiences for me, right? I sit across from some very unique people, and I just get to listen and I just learn things, right? I'm not, it's not a school learning class. I'm just learning things, right?
Yeah.
Whether it's just little nuggets all over the place. So thanks for sharing. Super cool. I end the show with one question. When I say Calgary, where's your head go?
1978, Mount Royal College, a kid from Yorkton, Saskatchewan, driving to the edge of 16th Avenue and finding out that my little red button on my FM channel on my radio actually plays FM music. And I dial in CJ92, and the first song I hear is Saturday Night's All Right for Fightin' by Elton John. And I start tapping my foot on the top of the steering wheel to the beat of the music, and then realize there's 4 guys in a little Honda Civic that are all crowded onto the passenger side of their car, stuck to the side window like a Garfield toy, staring at the dude with no arms. And I look at these guys, and all I could think about was, okay, I either give him the toe or I wave at him. And my mojo said, wave at him, because you are about to experience the most incredible life, brother, and you've earned every single step. That's what Calgary says to me.
Amazing. Thanks for taking the time to do this.
Thanks for doing this, Jeff. It means the world to me. It means the world to the world. We need better balance, and you're helping create such an important product to provide that balance, to remind ourselves, hey, brother, we've all got something to be thankful for.
Appreciate it. It's gonna be cool to be connected now and just kind of watch your journey. So
I hope so.
Thank you.
Cheers.